Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jennifer Nason, Global Chairman of Investment Banking at JP Morgan and a member of the board of the American Australian Association. And I am really delighted to open the conversation tonight as we come together in celebration of International Women's Day, which was this past Monday, and of course, Women's History Month in the US for the month of March. As all of you on the line know, the AAA was founded in 1948 and has provided an important forum for collaboration and exchange between the institutions and people of the United States and Australia, from US presidents and Australian prime ministers to leaders in business, sport, education, culture, and the arts. The AAA is proud to support the next generation of leaders through our scholarship program, which has awarded almost 13 million US dollars in scholarships and grants to over 900 graduates, veterans, and artists. So I am delighted to introduce our two speakers for the evening, both remarkable women leaders and trailblazers in their fields, political strategist Donna Brazile and the 27th Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Julia Gillard. Both of these women have broken barriers in their lives and careers, fighting for the advancement of all people in a fair and equal society. They have been both outspoken at times and always courageous. Prime Minister Gillard is the first and only woman to hold each of the positions of Deputy Prime Minister, and leader of a majority party in Australia. She currently serves as the chair of Beyond Blue, one of Australia's leading mental health awareness bodies, is chair of the global funding body for education in developing countries, the Global Partnership for Education, and is the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College in London, which through research, practice and advocacy is addressing women's underrepresentation in leadership. She recently released her second book, Women in Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons, which I recommend to everybody, which she co-authored with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, another very impressive leader. Our host for the evening, I'm thrilled to introduce Donna Brazile, Fox News contributor and veteran political strategist. She is the former chairman of the DNC. She became the first African-American woman to serve as the manager of a major party presidential campaign, running the campaign of former Vice President Al Gore. She is the best-selling author of several books with 10 honorary doctorate degrees from major colleges and universities. Donna was awarded the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal in 2017, which is Harvard's highest honor in African-American studies. She has served as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University since 2002 and is currently the Gwendolyn S. and Robert I. King Endowed Chair in Public Policy at Howard University. And I could go on and on and on, quite honestly, about both of our guests this evening. So I am just excited for this conversation. And Donna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I want to thank the American Australian Association for giving me this great honor. I can tell you just from this remarkable book that I had the opportunity to read, Women in Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons, that we're in for a treat. Prime Minister Gillard is a phenomenal woman. She has been a trailblazer, but most importantly, she has been a leader. She has been a leader that has removed barriers, that has put in place remarkable reforms to help women and girls all over the globe. And at a time that we are celebrating International Women's Day, where we honor the achievements and yes, the valor and courage of women who have dared to make a difference, I am also reminded that we must commit ourselves to ending discrimination and violence against women and girls across the globe. So it is with great pride and, let's just say, attitude that I have this evening with a trailblazer. Prime Minister, I hope you are doing well, but here we are 1 year after this pandemic that has taken so many lives, not only here in the United States, but across the globe. and everywhere. How are we doing? And what are the lessons that we should take from this moment?
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And it's just a delight to be with you, and happy International Women's Day to one and all. I do think, though, even as we celebrate women's achievements, we've got a lot to think about as we try and rebuild out of this pandemic. I'd say the big lessons for me out of the pandemic, the big issues for women are basically as follows. We can never forget that this is a virus that kills more men than women. So right at the centre of the crisis, the loss of life has been disproportionately men. But when we start looking at the ripple effects, then we find huge impacts on women. I think the first ripple effect is in our caring workforce, of the people who have been in the front lines doing the caring work right around the world. That is disproportionately women. Around 70% of the caring workforce is women. And then if you look at the next ripple effect, the impact of lockdowns, of people having to be in their own homes, of closed schools, statistics tell us that we went into the pandemic with women doing more domestic labour than men. And as the couples have needed to step up during the pandemic, it has been women that have done more of that work. Research out of the UK actually shows that even in households where the man and the woman are both employed full-time and she earns more than him, she is still the one disproportionately doing the domestic labour and homeschooling. Right around the world, we've seen record demands on domestic violence and crisis support service because for too many women, home is not a safe place. And then when we look at the economy, unlike earlier waves of economic downturn, this time it has been predominantly women's jobs that have been lost. So what do we take out of all of that? Well, I hope we emerge into a different future where we reevaluate, better respect and better pay caring work. We recognise who has got us through and how much that labour matters. We have the conversation in family homes right around the world about better distribution of domestic labour. We build back economies that are more equal in every sense, including in gender equality, and that we try and eradicate the scourge of insecure work, which has told against so many during this pandemic. And I hope too that we take the best of what we're doing now, the best of this technology with us, so that jobs that can be done partly virtually are done in ways that are more family friendly for the future. One thing I'd also say about this era is it has reminded us of how important government is. I think before the pandemic, maybe it was possible for people to say to themselves, doesn't really matter who's in government in my country, you get one lot and then you get the other lot and it doesn't make any difference to my life. I think this pandemic has recentered us on the fact that who leads nations can literally make the difference between who lives and who dies and how many people lose their lives. So I hope that it encourages a new and more productive engagement with politics because people realise just how serious it is.
You know, last year you had an essay, I believe it was in Time magazine, when you talked about the success of female leaders during the pandemic, including New Zealand's Ardern and Germany's Merkel. What did you learn from their leadership style and their role that gave you an insight into how women lead differently during a crisis or a pandemic?
I went into this analysis pretty carefully. I'm not a believer that men and women's brains are somehow inherently different. A number of years back, it was fashionable to say men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and we've got different brains. Modern neuroscience tells us that's not true. What is different, though, is men and women are subject to different social conditioning. And so when we look at female leaders, we are most approving of them if they manage to weave together what we associate in the back of our brain, where the sexist stereotypes live, if they weave together what we see as the male trait of strength with the female trait of empathy. And I think great women leaders around the world, like Jacinda Ardern, do that. And in this time where people have felt so anxious about their own and their family's future, they've wanted to know that leaders have had the strength to get them through, but also the kindness, the understanding to know that people are really anxious, and they wanted someone to reach out to them and help them through this moment of great stress and tension. And so that, I think, has led to people looking at female leaders, that combination of strength and empathy, and really valuing it. Or I think we can put it conversely and say the style of leadership that has most failed in this era is the ultra macho style of leadership, where you brag and you swagger and you bulldoze your way through, and you don't worry about the experts and you don't listen to people. And that ultra macho style of leadership might have got you through many political problems in the past. But you know what? The virus doesn't care about your swagger. The virus just gets on and does what the virus is going to do. It infects more people. And so that style of leadership has been a catastrophic failure at this time.
In writing this book, what motivated you, and also your co-author just had an amazing success in her own right, but what motivated you to write this book? It is well researched. In fact, I learned the difference in terms of the size of certain male organs, and I'm not speaking of those below a certain level, but I'm talking about some of the insides, the kidneys, the liver, the brain. I mean, you really talked about something I watch every week. You talked about the forensics of our anatomy, but what was the motivation behind writing this book? Because it is such a well-researched book, not just with the interviews you conducted, but also some of the background about leadership and styles and so forth.
Well, thank you for saying it's a research book. And yes, we did refer to those CSI shows at one point, making the point about men and women's brains and what they look like if you were going to study all the grey slushy matter that's in our heads. For me, really, the pathway to writing this book started when I left Australian politics, and I left the Prime Ministership with a series of questions kind of whirring around in my brain. You know, how much of my experience was about Australian politics during those years? How much of my experience was about decisions that I and the government took? How much of it was simply because I was a woman? And unfortunately, you know, as you would know, as every woman listening would know, watching would know, women's lives don't conveniently break out and you can say, aha, that's the bit that's different because I'm a woman. It's all raveled together and it's knotty and it's hard to get to grips with. So I had all of that whirring in my brain. And so to write my memoir about my time in politics, my story, I decided to start looking at the global research base on women and leadership, because I didn't want to write, you know, this happened to me, then this happened to me, then this happened to me. I wanted to put it in a broader context. And what I found when I looked at the global research base is, whilst there's some remarkable pieces of research out there, actually the volume of research, the depth of it on women and leadership is not as big as you would expect, given how long we've been at this project of gender equality. And so that led me to working with colleagues at King's College London to found the Global Institute for Women's Leadership there. And I'm pleased that we're opening a sister institute here in Australia. And it led me to a series of very animated conversations with Ngozi, who I had met when I was Prime Minister and she was Finance Minister of Nigeria. But I really got to know her in my years post-politics. I was travelling around the world as chair of the Global Partnership for Education, which is about bringing quality school education to children in the poorest parts of the world. She was travelling around the globe as head of the Global Vaccine Alliance, about bringing vaccines to the poorest parts of the world. So we found ourselves at lots of meetings and discussions together, and we were just drawn to each other as human beings. And we started this very lively conversation about women and leadership. What is going on with women leaders? And then I'd have to say, when Hillary lost, we went to ourselves, that's it, we've got to do something about this. What are we going to do? And we struck upon the idea of writing a book which brought the research to people in hopefully what they find to be a readable format, but then asked great women leaders, including Hillary herself, whether the research held true in her lived experience and the lived experience of 7 other great women leaders.
Only, I want to get to the book right now a little bit deeper, because in the book, you identify that of the 193 nations that are part of the United Nations, only 57 countries have ever elected or appointed a woman to hold the highest political leadership office. And you manage, in this book, you chose 8 women, seven of them who have led their countries as political leaders. And you also talked about their paths. What did you learn? And looking at, I mean, I was struck by some of the political path of Michelle Bachelet to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and then, of course, reading some of the more, I think, interesting story of how some of the women made the decision to run into political office. I think the one that struck me was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and that she was a Mormon that got involved in politics, that went to the United Kingdom and was recruited to come back home to run for office. I mean, the way in which you weave these stories together really paints a picture that women are often encouraged. Some women are perhaps born, some women are ambitious, but what was the common denominator of the 7 women, and of course, Hillary Clinton, who, let's just say, and I'm biased, I believe she did a remarkable job in opening doors for other women to run, and she ran a very courageous campaign given all that was the headwind that she faced. So what was that common thread in all of the 7 women who have led their countries and are leading their countries, and of course, Secretary Hillary Clinton?
Yeah, thanks for that question, because I think it takes us to a really interesting place. When we selected the 8 women to interview, we wanted this to be a truly global book. And so, you know, we interviewed leaders that people might be more familiar with. Obviously, everybody's familiar with Hillary, you know, Theresa May from the United Kingdom. People from reading the financial press would know Christine Lagarde, the head of the International Monetary Fund. In the US particularly, you would have read a fair bit about Michelle Bachelet, given her leadership of Chile. Jacinta Ardern is very much on the global stage, but we also wanted to make sure that we had Africa represented. So we talked to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman to lead a nation in Africa, president of Liberia; Joyce Banda, the second woman to lead a nation in Africa, president of Malawi; and Erna Solberg, the Prime Minister of Norway. And when Ngozi and I went into this interviewing, we were asking ourselves, can these women from such different countries, cultures, and contexts really have that much in common? You know, can an Erna Solberg from Norway, which is one of the richest and most gender equal societies in the world, can she truly have anything in common with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who, after her father died particularly, grew up in a great deal of poverty in Liberia, who left education early, who survived an abusive marriage, and went on to become a fighter for democracy in her country and ultimately lead her country. And intriguingly, what we found is, despite all of those immense differences, there were clear things in common. And one of them was in family background. Each of our 8 women leaders said that in their family, they were never told no. They were never told leadership is for boys. Don't you even think about that. That won't be your life. Your life will be in a private sphere. It will be in the family home, not out in the world of work. Each of these women was told in their family to aim high, to think big, to do what they could to reach the highest levels, to pursue things to the limits of their abilities. None of them were hothoused for leadership. None of them were told, unless you come home, you know, with the presidential badge on your lapel, or you know, a seal of office as Prime Minister, everybody in the family is going to think you're a failure. No one was told that. So they weren't hothoused for leadership, but they were given permission to imagine themselves in the world of work and in the highest echelons of the world of work. And that gave birth to ambition, which enabled them ultimately over time to come through for leadership. And so I think there's a real lesson there for all of us about how we encourage ambition amongst young women.
You also describe in the book how many of them crash through the glass ceiling, but a term that I've never heard of, and I've taught women in gender studies now for about 20 years, was glass cliff. So tell us about that terminology, and why is it that we must be aware of the glass cliff as women leaders in this world?
Yes, we talk about the glass ceiling in the book and the glass cliff. We do at one point say there's a hell of a lot of glass here. And the problem with glass is when it shatters, it makes very jagged, very sharp edges. But the glass cliff is an analysis that followed the Times newspaper in London publishing a piece that said, women CEOs in companies lead to lower share prices. It had looked at 100 companies and come to this conclusion. And a gender studies scholar, a woman called Michelle Ryan, who I'm very pleased to say is going to be the new director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here in Australia. At that stage, she was working as an academic in the UK. She read this piece in the Times newspaper and she decided she was going to see whether or not the Times had got it right. So she did all of the research work, and what she actually found was the Times had got the sequence wrong. The lowering of share prices, lower share prices, predict the appointment of female CEOs, not the other way around. And so what was happening is businesses that were doing well, everything was going fine. You know, if their CEO is leaving or retiring or whatever, they would say to themselves, basically, everything's going so well. What we need is a CEO who's a lot like the last CEO. And so the last CEO was probably a white man, so they get a white man. It was businesses that were in trouble that said to themselves, we've got to shake something up here. We've got to do something radically different. Business as usual just isn't going to cut it. What are we going to do? Oh, I know. We'll appoint our first woman CEO. And it's really important to know that, because lazy media analysis, and I've seen some of it here in Australia, that doesn't get that context, then writes in a prejudicial fashion about women's leadership as if women are failing in these roles, rather than recognising that often women have been handed a pretty poisoned chalice. And Ngozi and I are talking about her new appointment as Director General of the World Trade Organization in this world, with all of its divisions around trade and the fact that the WTO is moribund. And would we say to ourselves, gee, that's a pretty glass cliff challenge that she's just stepped up for?
Yeah. You know, you all talk about the hypothesis that women often have to deal with, from the desire to run, lead, or serve, which we call ambition, to the style, hair, clothing, of course, the sound of our voice, shrill or soft. Of course, she's a bitch, unlikable. In American politics, that's often referred to as likability and electability. You know, we had that conversation during the 2020 presidential conversation. You also talked about what I call family demands, who's minding the kids or the children, motherhood. You gave a great story about the Prime Minister Bhutto of Pakistan hiding her pregnancy for fear that would cause problems. I love this one from one of my role models here in the United States, A Special Place in Hell. Do women really support other women? To the modern day Salem witches everywhere, and finally Rhode Island. But in all of these analyses, you give us a clear picture of some of the obstacles that women in public office or in the public space are confronting. What about women in, say, academia? And because you're in academia now, women in the media, I'm in the media also, women in business, Jennifer's in business. What about women in other spheres? Do they have to face these same hypotheses and other obstacles or deterrents?
Yes, unfortunately they do. When Ngozi and I first started talking about the book, we wondered whether we should interview women from, many walks of life. So politics, business, the law, civil society, news media, and the list would have gone on. And we decided not to do that because we did want to make sure we could tell women's stories at depth. So rather than having lots and lots of voices in there, tell stories in a full and rounded way. But we also decided that the experience of women in politics, because it's in the white hot glare of voters and media, it is quintessentially on the public stage, that we would be able to see from the lives of women in politics the same kind of phenomenon that impacts women everywhere, but it would pop out really clearly because of the intensity of the spotlight. And I think that's exactly what we found. When we have spoken to other women, when we've looked at the research, there is nothing that leads us to the conclusion that the problems we've identified in the way of women leaders are confined to the world of politics. They're there in the world of business, in the news media, in science, technology, and beyond. And so I think whatever a woman does, reading this book, she will have a few aha moments where she can say to herself, something like that exactly happened to me. I got, judged on what I was wearing. I faced a differential test. I deserved my place in that room, but I could tell everybody was skeptical of me until I had to double win my place in there. Women paying an extra price for errors, women being pitted against each other to fight for the smaller slice rather than being able to come together and work together to change the rules of the game. Women paying a penalty at the family formation stage, being put on the mummy track rather than the track to promotion. I think all of these things will resonate with women no matter what their occupation.
And finally, in terms of the book, because we have numerous questions from all over the world, and I'm surprised at the questions from here in the United States to Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and we even have a couple of questions from France. But some of the lessons that I think are very important, not just for young women thinking about a career in politics, but even for women who are right now at some level in the pipeline. You talk about, this lesson for aspiring leaders. You say, you and Ngozi, be aware, not beware. Now, when I read that, as I went through all of the lessons, be aware, not beware. What's the distinction there? Because I kept going back, I read all of the lessons, because they're very important lessons that you give us, which I kept going back to be aware versus beware. Are you inferring that women sometimes decide not hesitate to lead because they're afraid of the consequences? They're afraid they may not succeed. What is it? What are you trying to say there?
Sure. The research shows very clearly, and I think I've lived this very directly, that if women, particularly young women, look at the experiences of women leaders and all they see is the gendered barriers, then that can put them off. So to give you a real life example of that, when I came out of the Australian Prime Ministership, a young women's organisation here in Australia polled its members and asked them, looking at Julia Gillard's time in politics, does that make you more likely or less likely to want to go into politics yourself? And this was, an activist class of young women. They were already out there doing things publicly, advocating for causes. So exactly the sort of starting class of young women who are most likely to be thinking to themselves, I could be in politics one day. But when they asked them that question, more of those women said less likely than more likely. So my gendered treatment had put this aspiring activist class of young women off. And the research tells us that if women like us go and speak to younger women, and all we say is, it's really tough, you still get treated very differently because you're a woman, there'll be extra barriers in your way, that if that's all we do, then we will put young women off. Conversely, the research says if we walk into those rooms or do these engagements and we say, it's fine, nothing to see here, it's a great environment for women, we won't be believed because young women aren't silly. They know that that's not true. But they will also think, if she's breezed through it as easily as that, then she's superwoman. And I'm not superwoman. And so I'm not going to be able to get on in this environment. So the only sort of safe course to role model and encourage young women to aspire is the sort of authentic centre, where you say, look, I'd love to be able to tell you that you are going to be a leader in a gender equal world, but I can't tell you that. It's not the truth. There are going to be moments where you will be treated different or lesser just because you're a woman. And obviously for women of colour, there's the combination of sexism and racism, the intersectionality of that. What we can tell you is that you've got the great benefit that effectively you've seen this movie before. Other women have stepped forward, you've seen what's happened to them, and you can learn from that and you can be ready. So when those gendered moments come, instead of being blindsided, confused, dispirited, disempowered, you can have your strategies about what you're prepared to do in that moment ready to go. So that's why we say, don't give up on leadership, but be aware that there will still be these barriers and get yourself ready for them.
I love that. This question is for you. I'm taking some of the questions. This is from JD in New York. How did you handle criticism, the name calling, when you were starting your career?
Well, the nature of kind of our Westminster system, where you're a candidate for office, and then you're a backbench parliamentarian, and then you work your way up, and then you're a shadow minister, and then you're a more senior shadow minister, and then I was deputy prime minister, and then I was prime minister. It does mean that I got a run up. It's not like I went from being not known by members of the public to, the office of prime minister. And so, I was able to learn and manage my own reactions in the early days, when maybe as a local member of parliament, I was getting a bad headline in the local newspaper. I could practice my emotional responses around that, and that helped build resilience. But the other thing that really mattered to me is, on that pathway through politics, I had the opportunity to look up at a number of the women who were senior in politics. And one thing I observed watching them was that they did really take to heart the good coverage and the bad coverage in the media. On a day of good headlines, you could see them, they were glowing, they were on top of the world. On a day of bad headlines, they were turned inwards, slumped shoulders. And I thought to myself, even as a young politician, that's a really crazy roller coaster to get yourself on, because, on both days, you're essentially the same person, same strengths, same flaws. You haven't fundamentally changed in yourself because a headline writer's put something very nasty on the front of the newspaper. And so even before I was hugely publicly exposed as Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Minister, I'd sort of got myself in this zone of, I'm not going to let the capricious criticism affect me emotionally. Didn't mean I was immune to constructive criticism from people I respected, but the nonsense that goes on in the media, and particularly the nonsense that goes on in social media, I had already built a protective barrier to keep it back so that it didn't upset me, didn't, push me off doing what I needed to do that day to keep leading my nation. Now, of course, there were some holes in that barrier, and particularly when there were things said that, were hurtful to my family, and that my family took. There was a very major incident when, I lost my father when I was Prime Minister, and there was a Conservative shock jock who said he had died of shame. Obviously, things like that, they have huge impacts on your family. So it's hard to hold them back from an emotional response. But I did build up quite a high, hard barrier.
My mother taught me when I was a little girl, she said, it's not what they call you, it's what you answer to. And I took that to heart whenever I got into the public sphere. But here's a question from Vanessa in Australia. She said, do you think sexism towards politicians and the media has improved since you were prime minister, or is it just as bad?
I think it's a bit better, and in some ways it's a bit worse. So, you know, the nature of the sort of feminist cause across history, I think, is we take a couple of steps forward and one back. Of the steps forward, I think we've taken, you know, in Australia particularly, when I was Prime Minister, the media, the political commentators, you know, the people who shape the sort of public discussions, their analysis was nothing about my treatment as Prime Minister was explained by gender. You know, the fact I was a woman was just irrelevant. I was being treated as every Prime Minister had ever been treated in the past. I mean, even when people were at rallies holding up signs saying ditch the witch and things like that, they were maintaining this fiction, this fantasy. Now, all these years later, there is a very intense debate in Australia about the role of women in public life, and no one would put in the newspaper or on social media, nothing to see here, the women just get treated the same. Everybody understands it's different. And that's progress, because it means that we're having the right conversation, and ultimately human beings only resolve big problems by talking them through. At another level, though, I think one thing that is worse is social media. Obviously, there was social media when I was Prime Minister, but the volume, the intensity of it is so much more now. And the hatefulness, the misogyny, the death threats, the rape threats that go around on social media, research tells us very clearly that all of that bile is disproportionately directed at women, and it's disproportionately directed at women of colour. And so, you know, I think the psychological load for women in having to deal with all of that is actually higher now than it was when I was in office.
Thank you for that answer. Zach from the United States, California, he wanted to know, what can Australia learn from the United States and the United States from Australia when it comes to seeking equality in leadership? Gender equality is
that's
these days.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we're, you know, people's very, very similar in so many ways, and such a great bonds of history and contemporary ties of affection between Australians and Americans. There are many things we share, but our political systems are actually quite different. And I think the Westminster system we have, and I know America is not suddenly going to adopt that system, but the system we have, where to come through to be Prime Minister, you need to have the respect and support of your colleagues in your parliamentary team, because they have an outsized role in selecting who is going to be Prime Minister. It's not a popular vote the way it is, or electoral college vote the way it is for President in the US. In some ways, I think that's a slightly easier system for women. And I think the research around the world shows it is a little bit easier for women to come through in Westminster systems. I think in your system of government, where you've got to do this sort of individual run for president, you've got to raise huge amounts of money. There are many barriers to entry for women in that. So that collegiate support, I think there are some things in the Australian model that are worth looking at. What I would certainly look at in the US, though, is the depth of philanthropy and community activism around women in leadership and supporting women leaders. I mean, we have brought here some of your models like Emily's List because we've been so impressed by them. But the depth of that in the US is far greater than in Australia, and we can always learn from that.
Emily's List was founded in 1985 here in the United States. Early money is like yeast. I was 25 years old, and I was one of the founders in the basement of a remarkable woman who created an organization. It has led to us, for the first time, having a Congress that is a lot more representative than back in 1985. 85. So here's a great question from Etta. Overcoming, she's from the United States, overcoming dealing with challenges in the male-dominated industry, advise women navigating inequality in the workplace.
Yes, well, I agree the challenges are there, and the book is all about the challenges. You know, if there was one tool we could put in people's hands to fix all of this, we would have invented that tool by now, unfortunately. You know, the overcoming challenges in the workplace, it's now so complex. You know, I feel that we're in an era where in Australia, in the US, in many parts of the world, the obvious things have been done. You know, I think back to my time as a young lawyer, when everybody was trying to go for their first job with a law firm, having graduated from law school. And back then, it was very common for a young woman graduating from law school to go for interviews and be interviewed by 2, 3, 4, 5 male partners from a firm. Now, no one would do that now. You know, the obvious things have been done, which means that the barriers that remain are in some ways more subtle, they're more institutional. I think they come in two types. They are structural barriers, things about work and family life, definitions of merit. You know, pre-COVID I'm talking, but if your definition of merit in your workplace was, you know, the person who's going to get on in this business is the one who's there from 7 in the morning till 9 at night, then you've already set a test that basically women will disproportionately fail because of family obligations, and men will disproportionately succeed at. So there are those structural barriers. And then there's all of this stereotyping that still lives in our brains. And it's not, you know, it's not a problem for people out there. It's a problem for all of us. The research shows very clearly that we all have these whispers in the back of our brains, and it can mean that we look quite differently at a young man and we think of him as a go-getter and we judge him on his potential, and we look at a young woman and we think of her as not ready yet, as not ticking every box for what we need. If she's sort of a very ambitious young woman, the whisper in the back of our brain will tell us she's not very likable, and that will feed into our assessment of her. So my recommendations really are, you know, institution by institution, workplace by workplace, political party by political party. You've got to have a clear-eyed look at what are the particular barriers here, where are we losing women, why are we losing women, and address those barriers. And for all of us, there's this labour of getting the psychological stereotypes out of the back of our brain and putting them in the sunlight, because once we do that, they can't survive. For individual women, I think that means there are choices to be made about when you call sexism out. And there's also how you build a network of allies and friends who will support you and potentially call out differential treatment for you.
I agree with you. This is from Jenny, and I see here she's from the United States, I believe, from the great state of Florida. How do we help males to become aware of their unconscious bias and bring them fully on board for gender equality?
That's a great question. And I think if we're all frank with each other, those of us who have been in and around the women's movement for many decades now, as I have been, there have been times when we haven't been as welcoming of men into this work and this conversation as we should have been, that we've given the impression that this is something we're doing. And yes, they can, you know, sort of be quietly supportive, but there's not a direct role for them. There actually is a very big direct role for them. I mean, first and foremost, you know, the statistics tell us that it's disproportionately men who have their hands on the levers of power. So if men aren't going to use that power for change, then we're not going to get the change we need to see. Second, the research tells us, and in some ways this is a little bit galling, but it's what the research says. If a man points out sexism, he will be listened to more seriously than if a woman points it out, because a woman pointing it out is seen to have an inherent conflict of interest. It's in her best interests to point out sexism. Whereas if a man does it, people accept there's no inherent conflict of interest. He's just doing it because it's wrong. And so men have outsized voices in calling out sexism. And if they're prepared to use them, they can make a huge difference. And then men, of course, can be mentors, sponsors, allies for women in this journey of change. On unconscious bias, we've all got unconscious biases. So we shouldn't be, as women, pointing towards men and saying the problem's in your head. The problem's in all of our heads, and we should be having very honest conversations about how we eradicate that in all of our brains, not just male brains.
I agree with you on that as well. Nathan from the United States, from the great state of Illinois, how did you have the strength to stand up to the horrendous misogyny from politicians and journalists alike as Prime Minister?
I think the main thing for me, apart from building this sort of sense of self barrier that I talked about before, was really having a very clear sense of purpose. You know, there is, for all of the difficult times, there's an absolute joy in politics. You know, you get to do amazing things, to put your values into action, change your nation, to change your world. I viewed being Prime Minister as a privilege. I got to do things like implement a new system to support people with disabilities in Australia. I got to do major changes to our education system and many other things that are still alive in my nation today and making it a stronger and fairer place. So there is an absolute joy in that. And so to get through the tough times, what I always needed to do was to remind myself of the sense of purpose that brought me into politics. You know, I came into politics fascinated by education policy, wanting to make a difference, wanting to ensure every child got an opportunity. When I became Prime Minister, a friend recommended to me, and I did. I wrote down on a sheet of paper the sense of purpose for the government I led. I kept it with me on the hardest of days. I got it back out, I reread it and recentered myself on let's get this job done, rather than let these buffeting pressures take me off course. So clarity about that sense of purpose, I think, is a very protective thing.
Putting your values into action. That is also in the book on your pathway to running for office. How important, this is from Michelle in the United States, another Californian. How important is it to return to international travel, to the ability for women to lead globally? I guess you want to know is how important is it for us to get back out there so that we can talk and network and once again have these real conversations where we can talk about leadership and making the world more inclusive?
Yeah, I certainly pre-pandemic, I was the sort of person who was always on a plane. So, you know, I live in Adelaide, Australia, but would have spent 6 months of the year traveling internationally. And then even when I was back in Australia, I spent quite a lot of time in other cities of Australia, most notably Melbourne and Sydney. I think, you know, the new future is going to be different to that. I don't think we're just going to return to that. I think we're going to take the best of this technology with us. So when I look back now on some of the meetings that I would have travelled for, you know, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get on a 6 o'clock plane to fly to Sydney for the day for a day of meetings, many of those things could actually be done more efficiently like this, with everybody staying where they are. But human beings need human beings, and there are things lost through interacting like this. You know, the sense of collegiate, deep collaboration, the serendipity that, you know, you go to a meeting that is actually about something else, but in the coffee break you get talking to someone and say, oh, I didn't realize you were working on that. I mean, in fact, Ngozi and I doing this book is serendipity. You know, we didn't go to international meetings on women's leadership. We were talking about vaccines and girls' education and things like that. It was over coffee and lunch that the idea for the book was born. So, you know, we as human beings crave that. We need that. So I think the future for us is going to be a balance. And, you know, we're only going to get there, and we've got to remind ourselves of this, we're only going to get there when we have acquitted the challenge of making vaccines available to everybody around the world. You know, what is going to get us back traveling again is safety, the safety that comes with the whole planet getting herd immunity from this virus, and that can only be done through equitable distributions of the vaccine.
I'd say amen to that. This is in the few minutes we have left, I have a couple more questions. I tried to get as many as possible. And this is from Maureen from the great state of Oregon. She wanted to know, do you have any advice on how to be an effective mentor to young, early career women in a male-dominated field?
Sure. I would say a couple of things. One, there's that balance we talked about earlier between encouraging and being realistic about the barriers. So I think keeping that balance in mind matters. But second, I think it's really important that young women in male-dominated environments get that the problem's not them. I think a lot of young women, a lot of women generally, you know, imposter syndrome, all the rest of it. Women have this voice in their heads that tells them, I shouldn't be here. I'm not up to this. You know, I'm not good enough. Study of a scientific business. So, you know, this would be a disproportionately male business. And in that disproportionately male business, scientists would be brought together to talk through hard problems. And the researchers found the women talked less, the women scientists in those meetings, and they thought that was a confidence problem. What they actually ended up realizing when they dug a little deeper was it wasn't a confidence problem. It was if a man raised an idea that was partly right, partly wrong, the group worked to build on the part of the idea that was right. If a woman raised an idea that was partly right, partly wrong, her idea was dismissed. And so the whole environment was saying to women, unless you're 1,000% sure you're right, don't speak. So in mentoring young women in very male environments, I think it's important to explain to them, the problem's not you. Don't get discouraged. Let's be really thoughtful about how we can change the world you're working in.
One more last, I have another question. This one is from Australia, Lily Rose. She want to know, in a world where only a few countries are led by women, what would be something you would like to see change?
I am a big advocate that political parties change their ways to pre-select more women. Now, there is not one mechanism that's going to suit right around the world. For us in Australia, in the Australian Labor Party, the Democrat equivalent, what made a big difference was adopting an affirmative action target. And so that means now, if you look at the Labor team in the federal parliament, it's pretty close to 50% men, 50% women. Whereas when I was first a young political activist in the late 1980s, early 1990s, women were more like 14 or 15% of the Labor team in the federal parliament. But whatever mechanism is used, unless we get to a stage where half of our parliaments are women, we aren't going to get the large numbers of women we need to be available to come through for the higher and higher opportunities for leadership in politics.
You have been very generous with your time, and of course I'm taking one or two more questions if you don't mind. And this one here is from Lucky. Want to know, what is a single tip you give to someone like me who is managing a team of 10 amazing, talented women?
Single tip, well, I guess count your lucky stars every morning when you get up, number one. That should be a leadership, yeah, a leadership job with a lot of joy. But second, you know, be very thoughtful, working with your team. You know, the women know what their lives are like. Listen to them, listen to their experiences, and make sure that every structure in your team, every work process, everything about leave, family life, flexibility is done informed by real life experience and done with the will to break barriers down.
Madam, I have to ask you this question. Women in Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons. When you, two amazing women, write the sequel or the paperback, will you include Kamala Harris in this book?
Yeah, we did, for the US edition, we did a tiny little bit of updating around Kamala Harris, but I would love, absolutely, whether it's me, Ngozi, or whether it's others, I think there is much to learn. as she goes about her journey of leadership. What a fantastic role model. What a moment to see her sworn in. So terrific to watch what happens in the next few years and to use that to make the promise come true that she spoke of when she and President Biden won the election about, giving faith to women and girls, particularly women and girls of colour, that every opportunity is open for them.
Closing thoughts on the future of women leaders across this world. Will we see more women over the next 50 to 75 years serving in leadership capacities across the globe?
We will, but we've got to accelerate the rate of change. The World Economic Forum tells us that we won't reach political equality for the best part of 100 years, and we're not going to reach economic equality for the best part of 200 years, and that's way too long to wait. So yes, we are improving, but let's turbocharge that rate of change.
When you're back on the airplane coming to the United States, will you come to Washington, D.C. so that I can host you at Georgetown University and introduce you to our students, and we can also introduce the paperback version and continue this conversation. This is a remarkable book, very well researched. And what makes it such an interesting book is that you cover not just the lives of such amazing women, Jacinda Ardern, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Michelle Bachelet, Ernest Solberg, Hillary Clinton, Theresa May, Joyce Banda, Christine Lagarde, but you talk about their path and what impact they have had on the world. And I have to say to you, your impact on the world is also amazing as a trailblazer and someone who has served as a role model for so many, not just in your country, but in my country, but throughout the world. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and writing this amazing book with your good friend Ngozi.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for a delightful conversation. I very much enjoyed it, and I would love to join you in Georgetown. That would be wonderful.
And as soon as I'm able to burn up and use all of those miles that I have on United Airlines, American Airlines, Delta, and so many more, I hope to come to Australia. It's on my bucket list, and that's why John Barry and Jennifer all know, they all knew that I wanted to introduce this book and also have this great conversation with you about women in leadership.
Thank you so much. We'll be ready to welcome you when you get here. It'd be great to see you in Australia.
And one last word, someone wanted to know, are you still writing a podcast? What inspired you to begin your podcast? That just came in from Leah. Are you still doing the podcast?
Yes, I am. It's part of the work I do with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. So we, of course, do very important, very serious research work, but a bit like the book, we also want to tell the stories of women's lives. And so my podcast is called A Podcast of One's Own, using the great Virginia Woolf saying about a woman needing a room of one's own. And I've interviewed women from around the world about their life path. And I'm going to be continuing to do that. So I hope people enjoy the podcast. I actually have post-politics where I was the subject of so many interviews. I very much enjoyed turning interviewer.
Excellent, excellent. It's been a great honor to meet you, Madam Prime Minister. Again, thank you for your remarkable leadership. I also want to thank the American Australia Association for sponsoring us. Go out, get the book, download it. This is a remarkable book that will inspire you, that will inform you, but most importantly, it will make you want to act to get more women elected to national and public office. God bless you, my friend, and take good care of yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.